This weekend marks the 400th anniversary of the birth of St Oliver Plunkett in County Meath. The former Archbishop of Armagh is famous for being the victim of 17th century fake news, a false accusation he'd been plotting a revolt against King Charles II, which led to his arrest and brutal execution at Tyburn Cross in London. Today, St Oliver's preserved head is an object of veneration for Catholics praying at St Peter's Church in Drogheda, and his successor as Archbishop of Armagh, Eamon Martin, has been marking the dual anniversary of Oliver's birth and his canonisation 50 years ago as a saint, to spread a message of peacekeeping and mediation. I've been talking to Archbishop Eamon about the saint and began by asking him to give me a pen portrait both of the man and the dangerous times he lived in.
So the 1st of November, Oliver was born way down in Oldcastle in County Meath. And the reason why we're celebrating him this year is because it's also the 50th anniversary of his canonisation as a saint. He was an Archbishop of Armagh, a Catholic Archbishop of Armagh who was canonised by Pope Paul VI in 1975. He was a martyr for the faith. He actually was hung, drawn and quartered at Tyburn in 1681. He was the last of more than 100 Catholic martyrs who were really the victims of very difficult times of persecution for the Catholic Church in these islands. But Oliver was quite an extraordinary figure. He had come to Ireland and he was really devoted himself almost entirely to the work of rebuilding faith in the church, to try to mend disputes and divisions, to try to build peace in times of persecution, times of great difficulties for clergy, for the people of God. And therefore he's known very much as a peacemaker and as a reconciler. So for me, this has been a beautiful year of a double anniversary, the 400th anniversary of his birth and the 50th anniversary of his canonization, just to draw attention to this man of God who literally gave his life for the faith.
During the 17th century, as the young Oliver was growing up, the persecution of Catholics in Ireland was so severe that his family, who were quite wealthy by the standard of the times, they actually sent the young Oliver to Europe to study, and he was still in Europe, I gather, when he was made Archbishop of Armagh.
Yeah, he actually went off to the Irish College in Rome. I think it was around February time in 1647. He remained there. He was ordained in Rome as both a deacon and then as a priest in 1654. He then remained in Rome. He was a professor in Propaganda College, one of the major colleges for further education of priests in Rome at the time. And it was from Rome that he was consecrated as Archbishop of Armagh. The previous Archbishop had literally been in exile for many, many years, and Oliver was appointed as somebody who might be able to go back to Ireland and try to forge peace, forge good relationships with leading figures, to build relationships with the Protestant churches, which he certainly did. It's really a time that I suppose, Mark, we can't really comprehend what it must have been like at this stage for people to try to practice their faith as Catholics in an environment where persecution was rife, where there was suspicion of any leadership within the Catholic Church at the time. But Oliver had that knack of being able to win the confidence of people, and I think that was his great success. He wasn't actually ordained an archbishop in Rome. It was on his way back from Rome to Ireland. It was at Ghent in Belgium, believe it or not, that he was ordained as Archbishop in 1669, and he landed in Dublin around 1670. Really, by 1679, he was arrested and jailed, eventually ended up in Newgate Prison in London and was put to death for his faith.
Coming back to Ireland was literally a risk that cost him his life. I mean, things eased temporarily, which allowed him to come back, but they didn't ease for long.
Exactly. Actually, there's one rather amusing thing is that he went around in disguise, as dressed up as a sort of a captain, Captain William Brown. He often wore a sword and carried pistols as some kind of army officer. And this allowed him to move around. But then there came a period later in the 1670s when he was literally being hunted down. He had to go in disguise. He had to go in hiding, live basically in hunger and travel around his diocese practices, basically incognito. But at the same time, there were periods during his time as Archbishop where he was really able to forge good relationships. He actually opened school in Drogheda, which took in not just Catholic young people, but also Protestants. I suppose he had this idea that education could liberate people from whatever difficulties they had. However, then those schools were quashed and he was once more on the run. So it was really a mixed period during that decade, roughly, when he was Archbishop, sometimes in hiding, sometimes in the open. And he also did a lot of work to solve disputes within the church between religious congregations, to try to reform the clergy, to try to really bring in formation and education, which he felt were the key to development and success and growth for the faith.
We hear quite a bit about fake news these days, and I gather that St Oliver was actually the victim of fake news in as much as he was accused of plotting to kill the king. And whilst he was definitely seeking to spread Catholicism, these rumours, which were known as the Popish plot, were actually an invention.
Exactly. One Titus Oates, who had all his own issues, he managed to sow discord within Parliament, and it became rather amazing that this plot at the time, which was more than fake news, it was an absolute, insanity, really, the sort of things that he was saying about Oliver. And they literally couldn't get witnesses to testify against Oliver. He was accused of treason, really, plotting to overthrow the throne. And of course, Oliver was anything but. He was very much a man of faith, trying to bring peace and really accord rather than discord in Ireland. But this particular, I suppose, insanity that was spreading at the time led to the imprisonment of many people of faith. Many people of the Catholic faith were hunted down, including Oliver. And Mark, I've just been thinking, Oliver was the Archbishop of Armagh. He was probably the most senior Catholic in these islands. And to think that he was brought to London, he was imprisoned for a lengthy period of time. He was then brought to Westminster Hall, no less, for his arraignment, for his trial. It was all public. And it really shows us the extent to which this kind of persecution had gotten. Mind you, after his death and his martyrdom, suddenly people realized this has to stop. So in some ways, his martyrdom heralded a new era of openness once more to Catholicism.
He had the same job title as you have today. That must be something that must make you think.
Well, I'm quite worried when people in good faith say to me, may you be like St. Oliver Plunkett. And at those occasions, I wonder, would I be able? Any faith leader nowadays has to ask themselves this question. Would I be able to witness to the faith even to the point of persecution, imprisonment and death? A few years ago here in Armagh, we installed a beautiful sculpture of St. Oliver Plunkett in the cathedral, and we dedicated it to the martyrs of today, yesterday, and indeed tomorrow, because sadly, and this is one thing we'll be remembering during the month of November, there are still huge numbers of Christians, brothers and sisters of ours around the world, who are persecuted, tortured, discriminated against, and even put to death for the faith. That's something that's hard to believe in 2025, whatever about 1681.
Now, obviously, after his dreadful martyrdom at Tyburn Cross, there were efforts made to destroy his body, but his supporters were actually able to recover remnants. And we have that relic, which is now so famous in Drogheda, preserved there in St. Peter's Church. Could you tell me a bit about that journey that brought back and how important that relic is today to Catholics?
Yes, of course. Well, actually, most of his body was recovered by friends who had been keeping an eye on this situation. He was buried secretly in the graveyard of St. Giles in the Fields, not far from the place where he was martyred. And then a few years later, his body was taken, most of it anyway, was taken to Lamspringa in Germany, of all places, where the Benedictines who had befriended him, they had rescued his relics, brought them to Germany, to the Diocese of Hildesheim, and they rested there for some time. The head had been rescued, although it had been partially burnt. The head had been rescued and brought to Rome. actually, and then a number of decades later was returned to Armagh, the Archbishop of Armagh, who entrusted it to the Sisters of Siena Convent in Drogheda. Actually, a relation of St. Oliver's was the prioress at the time, and it remained there secretly through right until the early 1920s, when it was brought into public veneration in Drogheda at St. Peter's Shrine, which is the main shrine church of St. Oliver Plunkett. The other relics have made their way around the world, as I mentioned to you, Germany. Then they were brought back by the Benedictines to Downside Abbey, just outside Bristol in England. So it sometimes seems strange to people, this thing about relics and parts of a body. But in the Catholic tradition, the relics are respected greatly, and they are to lead people to reflect on the life of the saint. So Oliver himself was beatified in 1920 and declared a saint, as I said earlier, in 1975. And so, yes, his head is there in Drogheda in St. Peter's Church. And it's something that I think many school children of Ireland have gone to see, the head of St. Oliver Plunkett. But nowadays, it's very much a place of prayer, just where people are drawn to reflect on the courageous life of this great cleric and this great peacemaker and reconciler, and in some ways drawn through that to reflect on their own call to be witnesses, to stand up for what they believe in today's troubled world.
We'll actually be discussing the whole issue of the veneration of relics elsewhere in the programme today, but can you understand that while some people take great solace from the shrine of St. Oliver, that others may find it macabre?
Absolutely, and I think, even nowadays, those of us who visit the head of St. Oliver Plunkett, although it's very, very beautifully enthroned or enshrined there in St. Peter's Church, sometimes you do wonder, but in a way, there's something about the tangibility of it, the idea that people can see, they can touch. This was a real person. In fact, actually, there are burn marks on one of the cheeks of the head, which has remained rather intact right down through the centuries. And those burn marks remind us that this was a real person who suffered, who died, who gave his life for what he believed in. And in some ways, I think people then, they're drawn to believe that the saints aren't some kind of ephemeral spirits in the sky. They are real people, and we're about this month in November to mark the month of all the saints, really, that there are other saints less well known, but good people, our own brothers and sisters, parents, grandparents, who lived the life of faith, and please God in his mercy are with him in paradise.
When St. Oliver was martyred all those years ago, the monarch on the throne was King Charles II. Today it's King Charles III, who we recently saw praying publicly with the Pope in the Vatican. Changed times indeed. What do you see as the future trajectory for relations between the Church of England and the Catholic Church these days?
Well, of course, I hadn't thought of that. I well noticed that King Charles III links us back to that really awful time. And there was something beautiful there about the fact that the king was able to visit with Pope Leo just last week, to pray with him, and then to receive a place of honour, or at least a recognition, in the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. I think those things are deeply symbolic of the fact that we believers, the Christians of all different denominations and traditions, whatever about our divisions and theological differences or whatever they might be, whatever the awful things that have happened between us, not least in this island of ours here, we still fundamentally are linked by our baptism, by our faith in Christ, by our belief that there is something better, that there is a reason for living today, there's a reason for hoping. And I do feel that it's beautiful to think that our relations are much improved here on this island. We have a lot of work to do to continue to build reconciliation, harmony, deeper mutual understanding, and in some ways to accept the terrible things that have happened in the name of religion, in the name of faith on this island, the way we have hurt each other, the reasons we have to rebuild friendship, harmony, and mutual understanding for our children, for our grandchildren in the future.